So welcome to the second of the Thomas Murray webcast series. Today we're going to be talking about lessons from COVID and the impact of the remote due diligence model that Thomas Murray has adopted, along with many in the network management industry. We have been providing network management services for global custodian banks and depository banks for the best part of 20 years. And we currently provide global network management monitoring of agent banks for 32 global custodians and depository bank clients. We are typically visiting around 95 markets, covering about 300 sub-custodians over a biennial visit cycle. Unfortunately, due to the COVID crisis, on March the 16th, Thomas Murray entered into its business continuity model, and we started transitioning our physical sub-custodian due diligence practice to a remote model. We have so far covered this year 70 banks in 26 markets, but we only managed to actually visit 6 markets before we had to go into lockdown on March the 16th. So to discuss our experiences of what's been happening during this remote period, I have 4 of our network managers out of our global network management team, and I would ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Sabrina.
Hi, my name is Sabrina Diaz. I'm a network manager at Thomas Murray, responsible for the Americas region.
I'm Sarah Peeling, and I'm the network manager responsible for the Western European markets and the Nordics.
Hi, my name is Toby Williams, and I'm the network manager covering the Central Eastern Europe region.
Hi, I'm Alistair Ballack, and I'm the network manager covering the Asia Pacific region.
Good. So if we start out with the practicalities and how we've found the logistics of running these agent bank operational reviews on a remote basis, and how we've experienced that in contrast to actually being on the ground and seeing these banks face to face. Can I start with you, Ali, for Asia Pacific? What kind of challenges have you faced in terms of setting up these remote due diligence calls in Asia Pacific?
Sure, of course. I must say, despite the obvious challenges with technology, the banks have been fantastic at accepting meetings, and there's been a very strong attendance from staff members and the understanding that it's still a necessity to carry on under the current predicament. I must say, covering Asia Pacific logistically, it's been a lot easier for me actually. With I'd normally cover at least 2 to 3 markets in one trip, which would mean 3 weeks in Asia Pacific with about 20 odd meetings. So for me, it's been a lot easier to break it down into more manageable size. However, the biggest problem I've faced really is the time zones, which have led to some very early starts in the UK, obviously with covering Philippines and Indonesia, which are 7 or 8 hours ahead of us. So that's been my major challenge really, logistically.
And Sabrina, turning to you, so the opposite side of the world in the Americas, have you faced similar challenges or different challenges?
Yes, on the Americas region, on early April, I faced some challenges having banks who accept to meet on a remote basis to perform operational reviews, and I received multiple requests to reschedule or postpone previously scheduled meetings. I believe it was mainly due to employees were still adapting to a work from home mode, and also in certain markets, settlement volumes had significantly increased, coping with the operational staff agenda. However, after the peak in volume passed, the main challenge I continue to face today is the time zone difference between the UK and the markets I'm responsible for, which has limited in many cases to 1 minute per day, and consequently, the time frame of market operational reviews has extended to almost the double that it would have taken if I visit on site.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, finally, in Europe, I suppose that with the European banks obviously being probably better connected from a communications infrastructure perspective, and obviously the time zones. Sarah, I mean, have the European banks been reasonably straightforward in terms of arranging the meetings?
Yes, generally it's been much easier, I think, than the other regions, and especially I have to reiterate as well, like for managing multi-market trips, even for myself, it's been much easier. For example, like the Nordics, where we've got major banks that operate across all 4 markets. So rather than visiting 4 markets, you can have one meeting, which has proved much more beneficial and time efficient. The only sort of downside, I guess, I've had more than anything is, like Sabrina mentioned, banks pushing back on dates which had already been previously organised. I actually had trips already, on-site visits pre-booked before the restrictions hit. And even though they were already locked into diaries, I had banks who then said they couldn't meet those dates, and we had to move them around. And there was quite a lot of jigging for some banks over various different weeks, and it ended up being several months later before I actually finally got the call.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously during that period where everybody was locking down, we were experiencing, you know, a growth. It started out very, you know, with 1 or 2 banks, you know, cutting off meetings and saying we can't have people in the office anymore, and then that kind of, you know, expanded right across, you know, the entire globe, in fact, and obviously that meant there was a lot of sort of reordering and rescheduling of the visits. But in terms of the way that the banks have then adapted to remote due diligence, I mean, do we think that there have been any real material differences in the way that the banks have approached our operational reviews? Have they provided sort of extra information because you're not able to go there physically? You know, how does it work with going through, you know, the process with them? Toby, maybe you could talk about this in terms of how the banks might have changed their approach.
Yeah, sure, Jim. I guess from my experience covering the Eastern European region, it's been very different. When the outbreak first started, you could see that the banks were struggling to pull it together. But as we've gone forward, they are adapting more and more to our calls and our questions. So essentially, the agenda has not really changed that much. And depending on the software or the technology that the bank chooses to use to conduct the call, whether it's via a conference call, or I've been lucky enough to have full webinars with screen sharing capabilities, I've still been able to get quite a lot of information from the banks, particularly where they do share a screen, and we can even get as far as a system demonstration or even evidence of account structures, which is slightly more limited when it's just a phone call. So they have adapted well. Obviously, it's not quite the same as being there on site and seeing the building and getting a feel for the place itself. But from an information perspective, I've found that they've still managed to pull in all the experts that I would expect to speak to in any other normal on-site visit.
Oh, good. That's good. That's good to hear. Sabrina, I mean, obviously with Latin America, you're dealing with only a few major players in that region. Have you found that they've had to change the way that they're presenting to you at all?
Well, in general terms, I would say I agree with Toby. At the beginning, you would see that you could sense that banks were adapting themselves to this working from home mode and some challenges that they were facing. But after that process has been completed, I would say that the agenda and that we've been covering during the meeting has remained pretty much the same. That when we go to on-site reviews, they have been able to include all relevant participants to attend the meeting. However, meetings have only been going mainly on via conference calls, not including video. And maybe in some presentations, they've been able to do online presentations and sharing.
And you'd agree with Toby and Sabrina, Rally? I mean, have you been able to get access to all the relevant, you know, personnel on a remote basis?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's been similar to Sarah. I had trips booked a few days before I was due to get on the flight, so all the banks had already arranged all the presentations to be completed, and I had all of the attendees listed already. So I was able to just continue as normal in obviously this different circumstances that we face now. But I think the main challenge that I faced really was the presentation skills from the staff members there. They really struggled to provide the information in an orderly manner with sort of 10 people on the line, all from different locations, which made it rather difficult for them. But all that meant was that the calls lasted longer than they would normally last in a face-to-face meeting. But the resounding feedback I got, was that the banks would certainly prefer on-site visits rather than the remote going forward.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we must remember that it's a lot easier to be able to communicate, when you're physically there with people, and you can actually, understand the nuances of communication through body language and gestures and so forth. And that must be very difficult when you're dealing with people whose English isn't, their first language. And you have the typical video calling or remote calling, troubles of people talking over each other and not being able to handle the mute button properly, and kids and dogs and whatever coming in during the meeting. Okay, so I mean, apart from the limitations of the video calling and such, when it comes to the actual, operational review and ensuring that the bank is doing what it says it's doing and checking those processes and those controls, how have we found, the remote process versus actually being on the ground in terms of its limitations? We can go through all the information, we can check representations, but what are the limitations that we've found? Sarah, maybe you could discuss that.
I think sort of the biggest issue, as we say, you've already mentioned, is the confirmation of actual documentation or seeing the systems. From a personal perspective, I think from the presenters, the bank side, when they're on calls, it's very hard to present when you're just talking to a screen rather than an actual person. And it's, the face-to-face you cannot beat across anything. Ultimately we are a people industry, and the relationship side is very important. And being there in a room in front of the bank and to have an actual conversation is the biggest advantage of the on-site visits. I'd say from a pro perspective, as I mentioned earlier, really the remote side is just the easier scheduling of meetings and being able to be more flexible, especially in terms of multi-market providers.
And Ali, you've just completed Indonesia, I believe. So I mean, did you find that there were some challenges in being able to verify all that you needed to do without being there on the ground?
Absolutely, I think the lack of validation is probably the major concern with the remote due diligence process. We always allow for at least an hour at the end of each meeting to do a full operational walkthrough, and I think that's where you can often learn an awful lot about a provider in each market. And without being able to do that properly, I think we're not able to perform a full due diligence really. However, from presentation perspective, I can't complain. They provided everything I needed, and even screenshots they're able to send over. But things like system demos, that's something we really look at in terms of assessing a bank's capability, and that's obviously not possible remotely with 10 different people on the line. Sharing screens doesn't seem to work as well, certainly from my perspective.
Good. Okay, so I think really the message is we can do enough of what we need to do, but it's not the kind of complete package that we'd like to achieve, that we are able to do on the ground. So I mean, finally, maybe we can end on a brighter note. I mean, although it has been an unprecedented emergency over the last sort of few months, and probably none of us will hopefully ever see the like of this again. But out of this, there have obviously been challenges to both banks and markets to have to adapt to a new normal of people working from home and not being able to physically do certain things that they might need to do because of market processes or bank processes, and certainly it's forced some an evolutionary step, I suppose, amongst market practitioners. Toby, maybe you could highlight some of the things that you've seen in your markets and how this adaptation has come about.
Yeah, sure. And it's true. I guess it's true to say some good things have come out of a pretty horrific situation, and the markets seem to have adapted quite quickly. It's important to realise that, of course, this isn't affecting certain banks or certain infrastructures. It's affecting everybody, and so we are seeing the infrastructures working closely with the banks in order to keep the markets moving and as efficient as they can be in this situation. One of the key things I noted in my recent calls with Austria and in Croatia is the physical documentation requirements, which have become severely reduced now. There's no longer an insistence upon physical documents with, I guess, what we call wet signatures, notarization, consularization, which, of course, some of the banks have been asking for a long time, and I guess that's been on the back burner from a regulatory perspective. So it's good to see that some of these things have actually come through quickly. The restrictions have been lifted, and it's hoped that that'll actually stay there for the long term. And the banks are certainly welcoming it, because it's not only helped them adapt to a difficult situation, but it's actually made things more efficient. Whereas before, the sort of heavily documented processes regarding tax or perhaps account opening have been made a lot easier for them, which of course they've welcomed.
Yeah, and I think the other main area that we've seen progression is towards e-voting, and several markets have liberalised the regulations around physical attendance to meetings, and I think there's some examples in Asia, isn't there, Ali?
Yes, exactly, Jim. Indonesia is the most recent review I've performed, and they've been very good. They've had initiatives in the pipeline for sort of 2021 to introduce the likes of e-proxy and e-voting, but actually they've managed to speed up that process given the current situation. So e-proxy has officially been made live, which is fantastic. It's certainly been a relief for a lot of the banks. They're not able to do e-voting yet. That's sort of the next phase, but once that's introduced, then I think you'll see a huge benefit. And to agree with Toby, the removal of physical documentation, certainly DGT forms and taxation forms, has been a sort of a blessing in this regard. And I think that's something where a highly manual market like Indonesia is benefiting from these evolutionary steps. And the market's been fantastic, in terms of easing settlement deadlines. They've tried to make it as easy as possible to ensure that, there are no limited failed trades across the market. So they really have tried hard to bring the market together in times of crisis like this, which is superb to see.
Good. And finally, Sabrina, so for the Americas, have you seen much movement in terms of documentation, e-voting, and other aspects where the market practice has evolved?
Yes, most banks have adapted its policies and procedures to become paper-free institutions, and they have also evolved to accept scanned copies and digital signatures to reduce client impact due to the current environment. And other banks also mentioned to have developed technology to attend corporate events, such as annual general meetings on behalf of its clients remotely, where it is accepted in the market, which is the case of Argentina. However, the only thing that I would say it's worth mentioning is that in the U.S. there is still a small percentage of processes that require physical processing, and they have resulted impacted by the situation that not being able to process the settlement of physical securities. So that it's an important thing to consider.
Good. So hopefully there are some silver linings out of this situation. Maybe callous to say, but I suppose the custody industry probably does need a crisis every now and again to kind of kickstart the latest sort of evolutionary step, and this is probably one of several that certainly I've experienced in my career, although probably not as serious as this. So I suppose in conclusion we could probably agree that although we are able to carry on our business of assessing the banks to a high standard, and we are getting the information, we are getting the communication, the banks do seem to have adapted well. Obviously there was that transition period of a few weeks where everything was disrupted, but a kind of new normal model has evolved out of that in terms of the remote due diligence practice. But it's not really where we want to be as network managers. We do want to be on the ground. We do want to put faces to the names, to build relationships, to check and validate those procedures, controls, and representations. Look at physical security. If there's vaults, we need to see the vaults. So, I don't think that there is a replacement model that is entirely remote that is practical anytime soon. But obviously, the markets have started to recognise that this means they do need to evolve, and there's kind of automation and electronic practices, electronic signatures being talked about, and the regulators and the market practitioners, I think, have adapted extremely responsibly, to this crisis. So. I'd like to thank Toby, Ali, Sarah, and Sabrina for this panel discussion. I think it's been very interesting. I hope our clients can appreciate that we continue to service them properly and fully through this difficult period, and I think that we'll continue forward, and hopefully we'll be back on the road towards the end of this year, doing what we do best. So thank you to you all again, and that concludes our webcast for today.